I'm very excited to be able to spend some time talking with Adrian Fontes, who I think is just one of the most important political figures in the country. Tell us your interest in open primaries. I mean, you've got your plate full with just running fair elections. Why do you expend political capital on this issue?
At the end of the day, this is a democracy, and that means that the people get to decide. And it seems to me, if you look long-term, it doesn't have to be too long-term, the people are deciding, and they're deciding against the major parties. Is it appropriate to move the system where the voters are moving themselves?
There is a tendency to leap over those difficult, because they are difficult, conversations, but they're so important, and I'm so glad you're playing that role.
Between the document that created the United States of America, between that moment and when we got the Constitution, we had these discussions as Americans. We had the Federalist Papers running around out there, and people were getting together in their salons and their pubs and here and there and having these discussions about, is this working? Is it gonna work? That's what's happening right now. And that's why it's so incredibly exciting to be here, not just with you, but in this space and in this time, and to have the privilege of playing this role, to be able to help people recognize this is America again, going through these adjustments that we do. This is what this republic was built on. It's the conversation, and we're having it now.
Thank all of you for taking an hour out of your day to join this conversation. Really appreciate it. I'm very excited to be able to spend some time talking with Adrian Fontes, who I have known for a number of years now and think is just one of the most important political figures in the country. Before I introduce Adrian, first I want to thank the co-sponsors of today's discussion, the Arizona State University Center for Independent and Sustainable Democracy, co-directed by Tom Riley and Jackie Salet, and Save Democracy Arizona as well. One of their leaders and spokespeople, Steve Goldstein, is here as well, and they're going to be asking some questions of you, Adrian, a little later in the program. I also want to introduce my co-host for today, a longtime friend and member of the Open Primary Spokesperson Committee, Danny Ortega. Danny is just a tremendous leader and asset to the Open Primaries movement. He's been a former board chair of the National Council of La Raza, which is the largest Latino nonprofit advocacy and civil rights organization in the country. He's also serves on the board of directors of the Cesar Chavez Foundation, the Los Abogados Hispanic Bar Association, and the Arizona Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. I don't know where you find time for these Zoom calls, Danny, given everything you do, but thank you for co-hosting with me today.
My pleasure.
I actually want to do a slightly longer introduction of you, Adrian, than I typically do with guests, because I find your political journey really fascinating, and I don't want to skip over it, and I want to share it with everyone. And please correct me where I'm wrong here. So
I'll do that.
Here's what I know. So you're a Marine Corps veteran.
Yep.
You're an attorney, and you jumped into politics the day after the disastrous 2016 presidential selection primary, which for those of you who don't remember, back in 2016, the Maricopa County Recorder of Deeds, that's basically the person who runs the elections in Maricopa County, Arizona, reduced the number of polling places from 200 to 50 without telling anybody, and ended up with people waiting 5-6 hours to vote. It was like massive voter suppression. So the day after that, you decide to run for her office. It was a woman named Helen Purcells. You surprised everyone and you won. You became the Maricopa County Recorder. You're in charge of the elections now in one of the largest, most populous counties in the country. You distinguish yourself by actually innovating. It's not just that you restored things the way they were. You created a system where people could vote at any vote center in Phoenix, in Maricopa County. You brought technology so people could track their vote when they voted by mail. Then you get on a plane in 2020 and you fly to Miami and you participate in a national discussion about open primaries in Florida and made a real contribution to that conversation. You run for re-election in 2020 and you're narrowly defeated in an election that by all accounts was one of the best run elections in Arizona's history. But while this is happening, there's people protesting and threatening you and your family's lives because they say Donald Trump won. This is unfair, despite all the objective evidence to the opposite. I always like to say, if it was unfair, you probably would have let yourself win if you were cheating.
There is something I'm not good at. Yeah.
Yeah, right. And then you surprise people again. You run for Secretary of State. You win the Democratic primary. You win the general election by the highest margin of victory of any statewide Democrat. And throughout this history, from what I know of you, you've distinguished yourself as a Democrat with an unusual interest in independent voters, in how you run your campaigns, in your messaging, and so forth. So my first question is this: you all of what you've done has got you on the cover of Time magazine. You're like a nationally recognized figure. You've distinguished yourself as one of the best election administrators in the country. You have this connection to independent voters. So tell us your interest in open primaries. I mean, you've got your plate full with just running fair elections. Why do you expend political capital on this issue? What does it mean to you?
Well, first, thanks for the introduction, and thank you for having me, and welcome everyone. Independent voters are voters, and that's really, it should be that simple, right? Republican voters are voters, Libertarian voters are voters, Democratic voters are voters. We tend to vote for different people sometimes and on different issues, but we're all voters. And the Constitution doesn't say you're going to help more people over here or more people over there. And when you're a guy like me and you swear to uphold and protect the Constitution, that means everybody.
Right.
So, there's that one thing about this experiment in American democracy, and I'll wax a little bit philosophical right off the top here. The transfer of power among human civilization has almost always in all of our collective history been either by heredity or violence. It doesn't matter if it was a kingdom or an empire or some conquest or something. That was always what was heredity or violence. We decided that we wanted to do it a little bit differently, and that's why we call this an experiment. And in some spaces you had a little bit of but there was always this major qualifiers that excluded a whole bunch of people, and we didn't. We decided to include people. In the original formation of our government didn't contemplate political parties. It just contemplated voters.
Right.
And not all people, or not all responsible adults were voters at that time, right? We had a different set of circumstances. So as we've gone through American history, first by establishing the experiment of American democracy, and then by expanding the franchise at every turn, really is what we've done, except for that one space in time where alien suffrage was eliminated. By the way, most people don't know this. You didn't used to have to be a U.S. citizen. In the last state in the Union that removed alien suffrage from its constitution was in Arkansas in 1926.
Really?
So yeah, so little known factors there. But when you're an election nerd like me, you know all this stuff. So for me, this is a question not of political expedience, because it's a little more difficult when you're even challenging your own party, like I did in 2019, to open that presidential preference election to independent voters or nonpartisan voters. But it's the right thing to do. And sometimes the right thing to do costs you a little something, but it's still the right thing to do. I sleep really well at night. After my loss in 2020, I was like, okay, cool. The voters decided on, that guy. If I try again someday, fine. And I did, and they came with me. And it's that sort of realistic, sort of just real direct expectation that folks who, if you're saying you're going to uphold the Constitution and other people's constitutional rights, then do it. Right? It's just a very, very cut and dried, simplistic approach to what this ought to mean. And, I've, for a lot of reasons, in a lot of ways, been a politics be damned kind of guy, which is why I get in trouble sometimes. But doing the right thing is the right thing, and I'm okay with it, because I don't. Some people cringe when I say this. I don't need to be in public office.
Uh-huh.
It doesn't fulfill some empty hole in my ego. I've got 3 kids that love me no matter what, and I've got a wonderful relationship, and I've got a law degree that I can fall back on if I need to work. And so I don't need this as a thing to fulfill myself. So what some people call political risk, I just call it's the right thing to do. So let's just do the right thing by all Americans, because they deserve it. It's the right of the American voter, not of any one party or another.
Wow. Danny, you have a follow up there?
Yeah, Arizona Secretary of State Fontes. Man, that sounds sweet, doesn't it?
It does, Danny. How are you today?
I was going to say Adrian, but it just seems so like, oh, he's a Secretary of State. But anyway, Adrian, glad to be on the show with you. As you well know, I'm extremely proud of everything you've done, and particularly this last election. I've been one of your most ardent supporters, starting with Maricopa County Recorder's Office, as well as the Secretary of State. Glad you're there, and I'm glad you're there for a variety of reasons. Most important is the attention that you paid to voters. You said it right, voters. The problem is that typically independent voters are not recognized as voters, because our partisan form of politics, right, has technically left them out. And so I think the biggest takeaway here is the impact that independent voters may have had on this election, including yours. And I want you to react to that. What is the takeaway as it relates to independent voters, number one? And if you have 2 or 3 others, please share them.
Well, I think what's critically important, particularly in Arizona, that isn't the same in a lot of different states, is the fact that there are more independent voters than there are Democrats. And every once in a while in Maricopa County, which, by the way, I will correct a bit from the introduction. Maricopa County, Arizona is the 2nd largest voting jurisdiction in the United States of America, with well over 2.4, 2.5 million voters. The only jurisdiction that has more voters is Los Angeles County. And in 3rd place is Harris County, Texas, the Houston area. And so when you have a state like Arizona, where none of the parties have 40% of the vote. In fact, the Republicans are just dropped below 36% of the vote statewide. So independent voters are really, really important. And it baffles me that the consultants from DC or wherever who come into races like mine and they start their jibber jabber about turn out the base, turn out the base. I'm like, yeah, that's great, but I can't win with my base. I can't win with my base. And moreover, I can't govern with just my base either after I win. I need everybody on board, because we're all doing this together. So Danny, it was the importance of independent voters is particularly outsized in a state like Arizona, where I will tell you, it will not surprise me if we get to the voter registration deadline, the cutoff in less than a year for the presidential preference election, but then next fall, the fall of 2024, it won't surprise me that non-designated or nonpartisan voters, I should actually say non-Democrats or Republicans, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But they're the majority. And we call no party designated. That's the official title here in Arizona.
Non-party preference.
But then there's a new wrinkle that just happened too. So I could give you all the analysis about the importance of independence, because they are incredibly important from a political perspective. But guess what? In my office just a week ago, the No Labels Party filed. They were required 29,000 signatures or 30,000 signatures. They filed 59,000 signatures to become a recognized party in the state. Christine Todd Whitman and Andrew Yang and their Forward Party are coming into Arizona. They're going to meet their threshold. We anticipate they'll be filing sometime. The word has it middle to late April. It may end up in a little bit later than that. But anyway, they've got till October of this year to qualify. So there's movement afoot. And I think what unifies people, including me, isn't so much the idea of independence, but it's the idea of not belonging to one of the major organized political parties, right? And then just recognizing that and saying, look, we all hate taxes, and we all hate flat tires, and we all hate Democrats and Republicans too. And I can say that even as a Democrat, because I love so many of the people in my party that worked so hard to get me elected and all that. But at the same time, as Democrats writ large, as a big bloc, man, I get frustrated sometimes, as do so many others. So the idea of independent voters politically is different here in Arizona than it is in so many other places. I was at the National Association of Secretaries of State just last week, and I understand that in some states you have to be registered with a party, I think, and that may not be totally accurate. It was a little late at night, and we had been, enjoying some adult beverages, but that to me is just it's just y'all ought to be able to just vote and not be beholden to that sort of like that power grab that the organized parties have established so strongly, because it ends up becoming an extra part of the government. It ends up becoming an essential player, much not just like the executive, the legislative, and judicial branch or the media, but then the political parties end up being one of those essential elements in governance itself. And that's not what political parties ought to be about. So there's kind of that added piece in there that I think is important when you look at it from a fundamental perspective. But politically, independent voters are super, super important, particularly here in the Grand Canyon State.
Jackie, do you want to jump in? I know you had a question along this lines. Do you want to take it from here?
Sure, happily. So, hi, Adrian. Great to see you.
Seeing you too.
Great to call you Mr. Secretary, too. I'm going to echo Danny's excitement here. Yeah, two questions. One maybe that has more of a national focus, and then another in Arizona more directly. You bring up the issue, of course, of party identification and how that influences the structure and sort of bleeds into the governing process. About half the states have what we call nonpartisan voter registration, which is to say you just register as a voter, and your contract, if you will, is the contract between you as a voter and the state. But about half the states require some form of designation, including that you can register into the major parties or into the new parties that are forming and all of that. And so I wondered if you thought that heading in the direction of a national trend towards abolishing party registration and just having the fundamental contract be between the voter and the state is a healthier way to go, and if that's been a part of any of the conversations that you've been in. And then the second part, Adrian, has to do with the political climate in the state. Tom Riley and I, in our role as the co-directors at the ASU Center for an Independent and Sustainable Democracy, we've been in some rooms talking with business leaders and political leaders and legal experts, in which the whole question of, what can be done to create an environment of trust and consensus around the transfer of power, going back to, what you were saying at the beginning. And so, on the one hand, the media portrays Arizona as a state that is heavily divided between the election deniers and the quote unquote good people, and I actually object to those categories myself. But there is, a fair amount of distrust and concern, and it's kind of across the board. And I personally don't believe that everyone in Arizona who has questions about the election is an election denier. They might be a doubter, but I don't consider them a professional election denier. So how do you think about, creating a different kind of climate in the state? And can independence and the trend towards independence be an asset in that process of changing the culture? I'd really be interested to know how you think about that.
Yeah, thank you so much. As to the first question, the second part of the first question, the answer is no. The idea of not having a party designation on the voter registration form, if you will, has not come into any of the conversations that I've been involved in. but I love the idea of that fundamental contract being between the voter and the government, right? Because it is the voter's fundamental right. The voter owns that right under most circumstances. And so there should be no need to declare fealty, if you will, to a political side. I'd like the philosophical underpinning of that notion very, very much. And so if it's not part of the conversation now in areas where I have influence, well, it might become. So thank you for planting that seed. But as far as the rest of it is concerned, Jackie, I'm really worried that we've gone too easy on the election denialists in our conversations. I'm really worried that we haven't held their feet to the fire for the fascism that they're proposing and that they are trying to move forward with. I mean, it's not just a mistrust or distrust of elections. What these folks are doing, and again, I mean, we could qualify it if we wanted, but I'm not too inclined to qualify too much. What I want to make sure that we do is look at, shoot, I think I've lost you guys.
We can hear you.
Yeah, we can
We
hear
can hear
you.
you, Adrian.
Can you see me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, great. Well, I can't see you, but that's okay, I suppose.
Yeah, we can see you.
In any event, the thing that for me is important about this is that we're looking at a group of people who have got it in their minds that we need to mistrust and distrust one another as Americans. The idea of election denialism, or the kind of this emergent fascism as I see it, is it's a destruction of the institutions and a sort of a surrender of the peaceful transfer of power. It is an erosion of the essential element in this notion of consent of the governed, and that's consent, that's trust, right? We trust that our next door neighbors, the ones who are actually running the election, are doing it well. I trust that the folks who are sworn to uphold and defend these rights and exercise these duties for us, I trust that they did their job and I'm moving forward. And so it's a lack of faith, and it's the destruction of that civic faith that has bled into a lot of other areas, a lot of other institutions, a lot of other spaces that we have trusted for a very long time. It's infesting all of this. You could make the argument that it's a long-term sort of liberation from the institutions, right? And we saw in the 50s and 60s, lots of institutional sort of rejection, a lot of people walking away from religion and other sorts of things like that. Is this another step in that direction? I don't know, but at some stage, we have to recognize that our systems depend on us believing one another. Our systems depend on that civic faith. And insofar as the elections are concerned, you can't have a peaceful transfer of power unless you have that consent of the governed. And it's not just so much consent in who the leader is, but consent in the system that got us that leader, right? And so how do we build back that trust, I think is, you know, we're really not, what we really have to do is fight against the mistrust and fight against the divisiveness and fight against the conspiracists and these people that would push us away from one another. And I don't know that anybody is really doing it effectively. You know, when I get on TV occasionally, and you know, and people will say, oh, such and so, they'll talk about election denialism or an election denialist, and I'll say, no, don't call them that. They're fascists. Call them what they are. And if they get upset, then they should change their behavior. They should change the way that they are attacking our democracy and that they are acting towards their own fellow citizens who aren't dishonest, who have integrity, who want to do good through the election process that they are administering in their counties. There's 10,000 voting jurisdictions in the United States of America. And all of a sudden, the hundreds of thousands of people that run our elections are all in on some conspiracy to, you know, keep one person from power. None of it makes any sense. None of it makes any sense. And I've always been an advocate of transparency and publicly verifiable elections. I'm working with Republican Senator and former Secretary of State Ken Bennett on a ballot images bill right now in our state legislature. It's a very, it promotes transparency in ways that make some people uncomfortable, like, whoa, that's a lot of information. And like, yeah. And so for me, how do we how do we fight back against that is with vigor and with strength and with direct language that will make some people upset. We actually fight back about it, because we spend a lot of time being genteel and diplomatic, and that's all well and good when we're trying to govern. We're not trying to govern here. We're engaged in a battle. This is real. And luckily it's just at words, right? We haven't gotten anywhere past that. And well, in some circumstances we have, but mostly we haven't. And so let's fight to win, not fight to sort of just like, okay, because we're not going to get there with these folks. And it's that kind of very assertive attitude that I bring into this office that, some people are like, gosh, you're kind of making some people upset. And my response to that is good, because I'm upset too. I'm upset that I had a staffer who was literally physically pulled out of a building and had to get literally rescued by court security staff and some of my staff by pulling that person back in away from these protesters. I'm upset that Rusty Bauer's daughter, who was dying of cancer, got harassed at her house at all hours of the day or night. She didn't get a moment's peace when they were out there protesting the fact that Rusty was just telling the truth. Yeah, I'm upset for all of those people who've left election administration across the country because of the harassment and the threats. And now we're running at a negative when it comes to the institutional knowledge that we have in our counties to actually run 2024. There's no reason for me to be nice to any of these people. There's no reason for me to be kind and gentle with my language and call them election deniers. They're fascists, and they're working at their level best to try to destroy this democracy. And so, yeah, I'm thinking that a much more assertive approach to this is what's necessary. And there's plenty of people that will disagree with that, and I think reasonable minds can disagree. But I'm going to take my approach. It's what helped get me into this office. And I think it's what a lot of people who voted for me want. That's what they want out of me. So that's going to be my approach.
Thanks, Adrian.
Sure.
I want to turn it over to Steve Goldstein, who is a longtime prominent journalist in the Phoenix and Arizona markets.
Is this old
that
KG
smile? I see
Steve
that
Goldstein?
smile. Sure is.
Steve,
how are you, Secretary?
How you been, man? It's been a while.
Good, sir. So, what you did when you mentioned Rusty Bowers, that means I'm going to modify the question I was going to ask you, and that goes back to when you were a recorder near the late days, and you were working with a mostly Republican group of supervisors at the time, and Bill Gates went through a lot of the things Rusty Bowers went through as well. So it's a two-pronged question. One is that you proved at that time, maybe privately you weren't that thrilled about it, but publicly you did a great job of being someone who worked with the other party, shall we say. You were looking to solve problems when you were a recorder and working when some of your responsibilities changed. And that turned out to be very effective, as John referred to before, the 2020 election, if not the best run, one of the best run in history. So going forward, when we think about situations like truly open primaries, if there is a ranked choice voting, top 2, final 4, final 5, whatever that may be, are those sorts of reforms potentially big winners when it comes to actually giving us a system where it's more likely that people are going to work together, solve problems, and have a more effective and less hyper-partisan government?
Yeah, and I think you hit it right at the end there. We have to look first to the purpose for proposing the change. Like, what's the problem we're trying to solve? And I think the problem what we're trying to solve is extremism in government, right? Regardless of the perspective. Extremism in government is bad. I think we can all agree on that. So how do we solve that problem? Well, the political parties are easy fodder for blame. And, not unreasonably deserved blame for some of that hyperpartisanship. Okay, so then the next logical step is, how do we reduce the party's influence in our politics? This is one of the ways to do it. There's no reason in my mind right now why Arizona should have any sort of partisanship in its elections, in its primaries. And here's why. It's not like 50-50 Republicans versus Democrats in Arizona. There's a ton of independents in Arizona. So with all of those particular points in mind, you'd think then, well, what about open primaries? And like you said, there's a bunch of different methods, ranked choice voting, top 3, top 5, top whatever. The notion here, in my view, is, and full disclosure, I'm part of not open primaries. What's the name of the group, Danny, that we're in? Saving Democracy, something like that. Anyway, there's a group that I'm part of. That's going to be promoting or they're going to be trying to put something on the ballot for open primaries. I'm a member of that group because I want to make sure that when those proposals get drafted, they're actually workable, that they will actually be able to move themselves into the scheme of Arizona's election law and practice and process in a way that can actually work. You've seen people try to like solve problems that you know, I'm trying to solve. I'm presenting a solution to a problem that doesn't exist. Right. That happens a lot in government. In this circumstance, there is a problem, but I don't want to see the solution become more of a problem.
Sure.
And so from my perspective, it's not so much about which one I like better, which format I like better, or why, because the why is a very political end. For me, it's a question of how to, in my role in that organization, I should very clearly say, it is how do I make sure, as sort of a technical advisor, I guess, that these folks are putting something on the table that will work for our voters, that will work for our election administrators, that falls within the 4 squares of Arizona and federal election law, that won't leave out any of our voters who are, you know, maybe on a reservation or disabled or anything like that. We've got to make sure that we've got all of those folks, all of those factors in play when we look at these things, including, you know, Section 203 language requirements and all of this other sorts of stuff. Okay, that having been said, you know, what do I think about it personally? Not as the secretary and not as a member of this thing. Why not? At this stage of the game, why not? I mean, and really, the folks who are more receptive to that right now ought to be the Republicans, because look who they put on the ballot in Arizona in 2022. It was a hell of a cast of characters. And I know because we ran against all of them. In fact, some of them still think they're running or something. I don't know. But so I think if that's the approach to solving this problem, great. But here's the step back that I always have to kind of look at the whole thing in perspective. In Arizona, are we moving to a place with the rise of not party designated voters and then this incoming newer parties? Are we in a space where the voters are actually doing that on their own without a change in the system? Huh. Are we in a space right now where the major parties are being rejected by if we're just looking at the numbers, right? If that's the case, then is it appropriate to move the system where the voters are moving themselves, right? So I don't think that factor should be ignored in the entire discussion. Because at the end of the day, this is a democracy, and that means that the people get to decide. And it seems to me, if you look long-term, it doesn't have to be too long-term, the people are deciding, and they're deciding against the major parties. So is it taking too long for that to happen? Are we seeing the last fits and starts of extremism that will eventually shift because it has to on its own? Are we pushing open primaries because it's the cool new shiny object? I don't know answers to those questions. I haven't looked too deeply into that, but there are some parts of this discussion I think sometimes get left to the side that, you know, we shouldn't ignore.
You know, Adrian, we're going to open it up for questions in a minute, but I just want to respond to what you're saying because I think it's so important. My colleague Jeremy Gruber and I, we get phone calls every week from people around the country saying, hey, here in Rhode Island, hey, here, we want to do open primaries. We want to move forward. What form of open primary should we do? And what we say is exactly what you're saying. We can't tell you. You have to go through a very rigorous, detailed, philosophical, legal, political, historical conversation about what are you trying to solve? What is your current culture? What's the current lay of the land? Who are your allies? Who are your opponents? And have the decision come out of that process. And I think you're right. There is a tendency to leap over those difficult, because they are difficult conversations, but they're so important. And I'm so glad you're playing that role.
Well, if I could just dovetail off of what you just
Yeah.
said before we get to the other questions, I think it's really, really important for everybody, particularly on this call. I mean, consider this, folks. Between the document that created the United States of America, which was not the Constitution, it was the Articles of Confederation.
Right.
Between that moment and when we got the Constitution, we had these discussions as Americans. We had the Federalist Papers running around out there. People were getting together in their salons and their pubs and here and there and having these discussions about, is this working? Is it going to work? How do we fix this? How do we fix that? Do we need to fix this? Do we need to fix that? That's what's happening right now. And that's why it's so incredibly exciting to be here, not just with you, but in this space and in this time, and to have the privilege of playing this role, to be able to help people recognize this is America again, going through these adjustments that we do. We, the people, are making this happen right now on this call. So like, kind of cherish that, right? Let it sort of like that caramel, let it wander around in your mouth a little bit and savor it, because this is what this republic was built on. It's the conversation, and we're having it now. And that's kind of cool.
Yeah, I agree with you. We should all let the caramel melt in our mouth a little bit and savor it. All right, if you want to ask a question, as Russ said, just type your name, your state, one sentence description in the chat, and we'll try to get to you. The first question, I want to keep it in Arizona. A longtime friend and colleague, Chuck Coughlin, has a question for you about engaging with the nonprofit sector. Go ahead, Chuck.
Thanks, John. I don't know that I asked that, but somebody did under that. It was Barrett.
Oh, that wasn't you? All right, I'm putting you on the spot.
I'm happy to bring it up, Adrian. We've appreciated your support of Save Democracy Arizona and the effort that we have underway out here trying to figure out something to put on the ballot.
Yeah.
But what are ways that you and your office are working with nonprofits, C3s and other organizations to try and advance your cause and what the very issues that you're talking about?
Well, we're doing everything we can to outreach with folks. One of the causes is, of course, voter registration. So we're trying to figure out ways to connect with nonprofits and not-for-profits to make sure that people are getting registered to vote. Under the current scheme in Arizona, our voter registration deadline is 29 days before Election Day. And while the technical backside of our system right now still needs some improvement, we want to make sure that groups and organizations understand that this is out there and that they can play a part in it. We're trying to get into schools and try to figure out more ways just to engage the public generally vis-a-vis this notion of involvement in the first place. Because I think the more voices we have at the table, the better representation we have about what everybody thinks. And that's really important. As far as some very specific engagement that I've had with some nonprofits and not-for-profits, it's in the area of advocating for or defending my advocacy for some of the legislation that's out there. One example that very much comes to mind is that bill that I talked about a little while ago. Senator Ken Bennett, former secretary, has introduced a bill that I think will help to make Arizona's elections publicly verifiable, which is a big transparency thing. And I'm a major proponent of that. All you got to do is look at my record and you'll see that. And I've had to really engage directly with a lot of folks in that world of nonprofit, not-for-profit spaces, a lot of advocacy groups, to help them understand the benefits of this, where their reluctance generally, from my view, and I don't want to seem overly critical, but I think their reluctance is purely political because this got introduced by Ken Bennett, and something similar had been introduced by another Republican previously. And so, I'm really having to spend some political capital on this directly with these organizations to help them understand that transparency is good. And so those are a couple of different ways that I'm getting involved. Obviously, my work with Save Democracy and the Save Democracy Arizona, that organization, Chuck, that you're a big part of, is another one of those little corners that I try to engage in. But it's quite frankly, even with all of that, we're still new into the administration. We haven't finished our second month yet. And I think we're doing really, really good stuff. We've had wonderful conversations with folks at the Brookings Institute and at the Brennan Center. We've talked to folks on the political right about some of the legislation they're thinking about moving into Arizona over time, and what the workability of it is. Not really opining much on whether I like it or not. So that work is all going to continue for a while. It's an exciting space to be in, to be able to talk with those folks. And it's a little bit weird too, because sometimes, you've got all these motives that people have, and their perspectives and what their agendas are, and it's tugging everything back and forth. So navigating all of these conversations really is a hell of a lot easier when I'm just like, here's the general principle, here's the value system. That's what we're going to go with. Now let's talk about like all the stuff that fills in around it.
Thanks, Adrian. All right, we're going to move one state to the east, to the land of enchantment, New Mexico.
Yes, the land of enchantment.
We have a question from Sela Absil, who is the executive director of New Mexico Open Elections, which, by the way, just passed an open primaries bill through the Senate with bipartisan support.
Okay.
Go ahead, Sela.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for your time, Secretary Fontes. It's an honor and pleasure to be in everyone's presence today. Again, my name is Sela Absil, and I'm the Executive Director of New Mexico Open Elections. And currently we are working on our semi-open primaries bill, which we thought was the best flavor of open primaries for our state in this current moment. So my question to you is, what do you think the role and importance is of the Secretary of State when talking about electoral reform? Currently in New Mexico, we do have the support of our Secretary of State, Maggie Toulis-Oliver. She's been amazing, speaking with representatives and senators in favor of the bill and how her office thinks that this will benefit our state in general. So I would love to get your thoughts on that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you bet. Thank you very much. And Maggie is a friend and a mentor. I've known her since she was the clerk in Bernalillo County, I think it was. So I've known her for a while. I think the role of Secretary of State in any electoral reform conversation is critical, particularly in states where the Secretary is the chief election officer. I mean, and that's not true in every state, but we need to be in the conversation, I think, because of the perspective that we bring. Moreover, when you've got folks like Maggie, like myself, like I think Steve Simon in Wisconsin, there's one other secretary that I know who has been an election administrator in the past, someone who was a registrar of voters or who actually had to train poll workers and actually execute the operation. We bring that broader understanding and perspective to the table, not just from a policy perspective. So if you've got someone who's got that background, even better, because you can really fill in the blanks, and hopefully you've got someone that's done it long enough and has trained formally perhaps to become a subject matter expert. But it's not just that. I mean, the idea of a Secretary of State is, in my view, much, much more prominent nowadays. And it's a position that a lot of folks are paying attention to, maybe for the wrong reasons. Maybe because we're questioning our election systems and the people who run elections in the first place, where we ought not be. But the fact that we are has really put secretaries of state into these positions. So yeah, I absolutely think it's critical that my colleagues across the country be included in these conversations, if only for the idea that they get included so they know what's coming, so that they can because a lot of times the Secretary of State will be the point where federal funds are distributed from. And so if you've got something coming, they'll be able to plan better, a budget or cycle or two ahead of time, because it takes a long time to do planning and then procurement and then creation of a system and then implementation and testing. You've got to have all of those pieces running. A lot of states are top-down states where the secretaries really control a lot of the systems. Arizona is a bottom-up state where the counties control the systems. The secretary, however, regulates those systems. So if only for that reason, we ought to be included in the conversation. But I think if you've got someone with a skill set and that experience, it makes it that much more valuable to have them in those conversations. And someone like Maggie is she's top notch. I think she's one of the best in the countries to be serving in that capacity. And I'm just happy to call her a colleague and a friend.
Thanks, Adrian. Want to go to Chris Gorman from Kentucky, who has a question about independent voters in Kentucky. Go ahead.
In my state, the legislature is 4-1 Republican.
Mm-hmm.
Just getting to cold hard politics, if I'm trying to lobby a legislator as to why we only have 10% independence registration wise. And by the way, I did want to say, did you know Grant Woods of Arizona? Grant Woods, the late Grant Woods, was a really good friend and a good colleague of mine. I assume you knew Grant. But
Grant was going to be the chair of my campaign for 2022, but the son of a gun up and died on me, so I had to.
Right. What a wonderful
widow. I had to count on his widow, Marlene, to chair my campaign, and she did a great job. We're very good friends now. But yeah, I knew Grant. Yeah.
Well, my question is, if I'm talking to a Republican legislator and knowing that it's a two-party state with only 2% independents, they control the legislature 80%, 80 to 20 in the House, and it's about the same in the Senate. What's my best argument as to why does it benefit the Republican Party in Kentucky if they control the state almost totally? Why does it benefit them to allow open primaries?
It doesn't. If they're coming at this from the perspective of being a Republican first, it doesn't benefit them at all. But if they want to be an American first, then it does. If they want to be a Kentuckian first, then it does. And it really is that simple. Sometimes you just hit them with the truth of it. The party systems are the reason why this conversation is happening in the first place. You and I are talking to each other because of the stranglehold that political parties have on our politics. And so sometimes you just got to come at it with the truth. If you are going to legislate as a Republican for the benefit of Republicans only, not for the benefit of all Kentuckians, and not for the benefit of the United States of America, then you stick with what you've got. And we know where your interests lie.
What if I approach it from the other standpoint? I understand there are 9 states that allow an open primary in the Democratic primary, but not the Republican. What if I approach it from that standpoint and talk to the Democrats as to why this would benefit them? That they would obviously have more people participating in their primary. I would think, wouldn't it benefit the Democrats? Wouldn't that be the best argument, or is there a better argument for me? I just don't know where to start.
Well, I'm assuming by the nature of your question that in Kentucky, if the Democrats wanted to open their primary, they could.
I believe that's true. I believe that's true.
Yeah, that's true in every state. The parties can supersede election law if they want to.
Okay, and that's fair. There's so much going on. I didn't know it was true in every state. Okay. So yeah, as far as the Democrats are concerned, absolutely, that's a plus. It's an argument that I tried to make in 2019 when I asked my party to open up the presidential preference election and let independents vote, because I told them flat out, you're going to get more of your candidates into the state, and they're going to be talking to more voters, more of those moderate voters, more of those middle of the road, I don't like the party's voters, but they're going to vote in the general election after all anyway. So here's the thing, and I will say this respectfully. I get asked a lot questions about, what do I say to this person? What do I say to that person? I can't give you a script. I'm not that guy. What I can do is talk to you about the principles and those values and those facts around the message that you need to create. And I used to say this to people on the campaign trail when they'd say, Adrian, what do we do when we're talking to people about why they should vote for you? And I would tell them, first and foremost, and this sounds a little corny, but stick with me here. First and foremost, you got to put all of that stuff in your head, your principles, your values on this subject, why it's important to you. And then you got to give yourself the gift of a little bit of time. Give yourself the gift of about 10 or 15 minutes and just sit and think carefully about what words you're going to be able to say, what phrases you're going to be able to connect with. Now, obviously, it's different if you're talking to politicians than if you're talking to voters. I get that 100%. And so this may not directly apply. But if you're the messenger, your message is going to be the most effective. Your authenticity is going to be the most effective. You're not speaking from a script is going to be the most effective. The fact that you feel it in your heart is going to be the most effective. Now, you may not really get anywhere. That doesn't mean you didn't have an impact. That doesn't mean you didn't get someone to start thinking about something so that you could build on it over time. Nothing really good happens right away. Other than kind of speaking around it a bit, I can't tell you what words to say other than, you know, your folks way better than I ever will. You know what makes them tick. You know what makes them think. Use that. Give yourself enough credit and enough grace and enough time to put all of that stuff together and then just come at them as hard as you can. I'm a big fan of directness and honesty. I'm not a big fan of dancing around, mealy mouthing around the bush to eventually try to get someone to like me. People may not like me, but the ideas people will identify with, and they'll be able to take those. So that's about the best advice I dare give you. And I hope you understand why.
You've helped me focus quite a bit. And I think I see where we go. We go to the Democratic Party and explain to them. I think that's what's possible here. Okay, thank you.
Well, that came from you, not me. So
I understand.
Good on you. Yeah.
You know, one other thought, Chris, I think we should introduce you to Joe Kirby. Joe Kirby is a leader of South Dakota open primaries. He is as conservative a Republican as you will ever find. And the Republican Party of South Dakota has a bigger majority than in Kentucky. And he wrote an op-ed that was absolutely a wonderful statement about why conservative Republicans in a state dominated by Republicans should embrace more competition, more openness, more fairness, because it's actually that if you want to talk about the core of conservatism without competition doesn't work. And there might be a way to infuse some of that in Kentucky and saying, like, if we want to live up to our conservative principles, we need to have a fair, free, open market for a competition of ideas and let the best ideas win. Anyway, we'll introduce you to Joe, because that might be a helpful conversation to help you build what you're building in Kentucky.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, we've got just a few more minutes here. We've got way too many questions and they're all really great. I want to go to Barry Doxwell, who has a legal question. Go ahead, Barry. You there? You still there, Barry? Okay, we'll come back to Barry if he gets up.
Okay, I'm with you now. Sorry about that.
You're there. Okay. Hi, Barry.
Yeah, my question is, hi, sorry. My question is, in a given state, can taxpayers go to the courts as a constitutional issue and say, I'm not getting equal treatment under the law? I'm being forced to help pay for primary elections that I myself am not permitted to vote in.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm going to defer to someone who's actually practicing and is willing to give you legal advice. While I am a licensed attorney, I'm not going to go there exactly. But look, generally speaking, anybody can sue anybody for just about anything, right? And I don't know that a suit like that would have legs, frankly. But I do know that it's sometimes worth it to fight those battles that you may not know that you're going to. Hell, I didn't think I was going to beat Helen Purcell in 2016. You know, just ask Danny. It was a fool's errand at the time, and I ended up winning because we did it well. So I do think it's unjust, and I do think it's I think it's called unjust enrichment, where the state is actually paying for partisan primaries. I don't know. This is not legal advice, but give it a shot, right? You know, I can't tell you for sure if that's going to succeed.
Barry, just to let you know, we just won an important court case last month in Delaware. There was a law in Delaware that says if you're an independent voter, you cannot run for election judge. So literally a law saying you have to be a Democrat or Republican to be an election judge. And the court just struck it down as unconstitutional under the US Constitution and the state constitution. And in some ways, our hope is that this creates a bit of a snowball to start challenging more and more of the laws that are discriminatory against independents. And it's primaries, obviously, but it's much deeper than primaries. It's election administration. It's a whole range of things. There's some states, New York, you can't even be a poll worker if you're an independent voter. Yeah. So hopefully the next, 2 to 10 years, we're going to see a lot of litigation on the systematic discrimination against independents. Sorry to take away your time, Adrian.
No, that's in Arizona, the county party chairs are the ones who appoint their own partisans to do the mandatory hand count audit after the election. So they're not they have no obligation to appoint independents. So that's good for that Delaware court.
One more question, and then we have to wrap up, and we're going back to Arizona. It's a question from, I'm losing it here. Hold on. Oh, Mike Rakowski about automatic voter registration in Arizona. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, thank you very much. I had a nice conversation the other day with Michael from Oregon and what they're doing with open primaries.
Where are you in Arizona, Mike?
I'm in Phoenix. I'm in North Phoenix. Okay. Yeah, and I've done a lot of door-to-door and voter registration and so on. And as Adrian well knows, that's one aspect, and I'm glad to do it, but it's another one of those obstacles, one of those hurdles along the way for people being able to freely and fairly and easily vote. And of course, Oregon is also one of those states that has 100% mail-in ballots. There are a total of 5 of them. But I was wondering if Adrian sees the possibility that voter registration would become easier or at best automatic in the state.
Well, listen, if you want the most accurate voter rolls and you want to be able to verify that the people on those rolls are A, not felons, B, US citizens, C, over 18, D, not dead, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, then we should introduce a system in Arizona that goes to all of the pertinent databases that we have access to, and perhaps even a couple of commercial databases so that we can see where people are moving with relative ease. That would give us the cleanest, most verified, most authentic voter registration rolls. The failure of this corner of the movement, in my mind, is that we're calling it automatic voter registration. Because to Republicans in power in a place like Arizona, it sounds like an entitlement. Oh, you automatically get it. No, you got to earn it, they'll say. Well, fine. Why don't we call it authentic voter registration? That means they've been verified. That means they've gone through whatever checks and they are an authentic voter. The difference is zero. It's
as
zero
you know,
difference.
Adrian, and by the way, you didn't mention your considerable musical skills, okay? But
but that's what I'm saying. So my point is, I absolutely think that it's a good system because it helps the administrator, it helps the voter, it helps build confidence, et cetera. It's much easier on the voter for access purposes, which I'm 100% behind. Everyone who's eligible is automatically registered. I should say authentically registered, but we got to be able to sell it. And in order to do that, sometimes, look, we're in the business of idea selling here. And that's, for me, the biggest failure of the movement is we've stuck to this automatic voter registration when authentic voter registration could be the same thing. And I think it could succeed. And both sides would get what they wanted. The right would get an exclusive list and the left would get a list with everybody on it, which is the same thing.
Wow.
That's great. Thanks.
Yeah.
Danny, before we wrap up, any final thoughts or questions?
Well, first of all, I want to thank Adrian for a wonderful presentation as usual, from the heart, honest and transparent, and would encourage people to continue to make America as great as it's ever been, and by participating to the fullest extent allowable by law, and to continue to fight to make all elections open to everyone who's qualified to do so.
Yeah, I second that. That's very well put. Adrian, thank you for taking time. Really, it's much appreciated. And I know you're only 2 months into the job, but you're already having an impact, and we're behind you. So thank you for your great work. Just 2 quick announcements before we go. Our next conversation, and this is relevant to the No Labels Party in Arizona. We're going to be talking with Dr. Ben Chavis, who is the new co-director of No Labels. He's a longtime civil rights leader and is now leading an effort for No Labels to put a presidential ticket on the ballot in 2024. We're going to be talking with him on March 21st at 2 p.m. You'll get an invite for that. The second thing is, as Sheila mentioned, there's a real timely fight going on in New Mexico. And the big test is going to be this week or early next week in the Judiciary Committee. And we're working to pull out all the stops to put pressure on them. So my ask is this: if you have a friend, a family member, a college roommate, a niece or nephew, anybody that you know who lives in New Mexico, we want to talk to them and ask them to put a phone call or an email into their state representative to vote yes on this bill in the Judiciary Committee. Send an email to info@openprimaries.org and just say, I know someone in New Mexico, and we will call you or email you in the next 24 hours to follow up on that. This is a real live opportunity in which we have a shot of passing a bill, and we want to pull out all the stops. So I want to ask for all of your help. Send an email to info@openprimaries.org, and we'll call you right back and let you know what you can do. Thank you, Adrian. Thank you, all of you. Thank you, Jackie and Steve, Tom Riley, all our co-sponsors. This has been a great conversation, and we'll see you next month. Take care.
Thank you.